Hello, in this companion video covering ACI Multi-Site Orchestrator, I'm going to show you a demonstration, this time covering the topics of schemas and templates in action. I'll start out by creating a new tenant from inside MSO. From there, we'll set up our very first schema, and inside that schema, we're going to deploy a number of templates for our new Greenfield tenant example. We'll start out with a stretch template that is going to hold all of the common items that will live equally across both sites. These are things like VRFs, contracts, and application profiles. Then I'll build a few more templates, one per site, and this is going to hold all of the items that are unique and specific to a given site. And these are things like bridge domains and EPGs in my example. And then I'll finish off by importing an existing tenant into MSO, or the Brownfield example. Once I have it in MSO, I'll manipulate it, make some changes, and then I'll extend or push that tenant to live across both of my sites. Very quickly, I just wanted to remind you of the topology that I'm using for this video. I've got site 1, which is represented by Amsterdam on the left, and I've got site 2, which is represented by Barcelona on the right, and I've already deployed my MSO cluster. So let's take a quick look at schema number 1. This is the Greenfield example. So what I'm going to do is create a brand new tenant in MSO, and I'm going to call that tenant green. Once I have that tenant inside MSO, what I'll do is I'll create my schema, and then I'll create a stretch template that will hold a number of common items that will be stretched equally across both of my sites. In this particular case, I'll create a VRF called V1, and then I'll create a series of contracts and filters. Then I'll create a second template, or the template that lives only in site 1. I'll create some bridge domains and some EPGs that you see here. And then following on that, I'll create another template, or a template for site 2 only, and I'll create unique bridge domains and EPGs that are specific to site 2. For schema number 2, this would be importing an existing tenant. So in my site number 1, Amsterdam, I have a tenant that already existed before MSO came along, and that tenant is named Tenant Brown. It has its own VRF, bridge domains, and EPGs, contracts, and filters. So what I'll do is I'll begin by importing all of those objects into MSO. So from that point forward, this particular tenant will be managed solely by MSO. I'll take the common objects, the tenant, the VRF, and the contracts and filters, and I will extend them to live across both my sites, Amsterdam and Barcelona. Then I'll create some Barcelona or site 2 specific objects, bridge domains, EPGs, etc. And then I'll show you a third example where I take the BD stretched and EPG stretched that I imported into Tenant Amsterdam, and I will actually stretch them across to live in both Amsterdam and Barcelona and show you just how easy that is. Okay, and with that understanding, let's actually move to the demonstration part. Okay, so here I am logged into Multi-Site Orchestrator. This should look familiar to you by now. What I need to do here first is create a tenant, and this tenant is going to be my Greenfield tenant, so it will live in both sites. So where will I go? So on the menu bar on the left, and I'm using the Multi-Site Orchestrator version 3, so the look is just a little bit different from what you might be used to in the 2.x version. So in this particular case, I need to go under Application Management, and you can see this is where we find tenants and schemas, so we're going to be doing all of our work here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a tenant. So by clicking on tenants, all we have to do is add a tenant, and we're going to call this guy green because he's our Greenfield example. The next thing we need to do is choose where this tenant needs to live, i.e. which sites it should exist in. And in this particular case, we want tenant green to live in both Amsterdam and in Barcelona sites, so we'll tick both of those boxes. And it's as easy as that, and we'll just click save and move on. So we can see here that tenant green has been successfully created, and that's exactly what we want to see. Okay, now the next thing is we need to go and create our very first schema. So again, in the left bar under Application Management, we'll go ahead and click on Schemas, and we see we don't have any schemas. This is a new deployment here. So we're going to go ahead and click on the button Add Schema. We can give this schema a name, so we'll call this Greenfield, and off we go. If you remember, we need to build a number of templates, and the very first template that I want to build is a template that will hold all of the common objects that will exist in both sites. And that's a short list, but it's important. So in this particular case, we want the filters, contracts, and the VRFs all to live equally in both sites. So I'm going to rename my template here, and I'll just call this common items. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to select the tenant that we want to work with in this particular template. So you click here on the box here that says select a tenant, and to the right you have a list of all available tenants. Well, right now the only two tenants I could choose is common, which comes out of the box, and we're not working with common, but here's our tenant green that we just created a few moments before, so I'll go ahead and select that. So that opens up all of the options that I could then create for our tenant called green. So if you remember, one of the things we wanted to live equally in both sites was a VRF, and that VRF we called V1. Now I'm going to create a very simple single filter and a very simple contract that allows everything, just to show you how it's done, but of course you can get as specific as you want in your own environment. So the first thing I'll do is I'll create a filter here, and I'll just call this something like allow everything, because I'm going to be very open about this filter. Clicking on the entry and give it a name, and then you have to specify ether type, IP, and such. If I leave it as unspecified across the board, that basically says allow everything layer 2 and up, don't discriminate anything, so allow it all. And so that's my simple filter. Of course you can pick things like IP, TCP, and we'll show that in future demonstration videos, but for now, for simplicity, I'm just going to create the simplest contract and filter you ever saw. So we'll click on save. So we've got our filter that's called all, and you can see the filter name here is called allow all, and the entry is called all. The next thing we need to do is to create a contract. And so we'll go here and we'll call this, we'll give a really fancy name. We'll call it C1 for contract 1. We can set the scope. I'll leave it at the VRF level, but this is where we would attach our filter that we just created. So allow all, and we'll click on save. So we've created the objects that will live across both sites, but in this particular case, all we've done is create a template. We actually haven't deployed anything yet. This is sort of our sandbox to build our policy, but it doesn't actually get applied until we save it and we deploy it to the sites that we want. So the first thing I'll do is I'll click save just to be on the safe side. You can see we've got our template called common items here. So what we need to do here is if we click on the 3 little dots, you'll see that a little menu pops up, and one of those options is add sites. And this is where we bind sites to a given template. So I'm going to go ahead and click on add sites. Now remember, this is the template that is equal to both sites, so I'm going to pick both. Once I click on that, you see that I get a sites level sub view here on the left of all the sites that I'm working with, and then all of the templates that I've actually associated to those sites. In this case, a single template called common items across both. I also want to point out that we've got a little yellow triangle here, and if we hover over it, it says you've built this policy, you've associated sites, but you actually haven't deployed this policy yet, and it won't actually be pushed or written to these respective sites until you click the button over here called deploy sites. So I'll go ahead and click on deploy sites, and in just a second I'll get a view that is actually quite useful, and it's something to pay attention to. It gives me a list of all of the objects and the names. It gives me a column of each of the sites, so Amsterdam and Barcelona, and it tells me what it's actually going to do. And in this case, it's going to say, I'm going to create these objects in the list here, and I'm going to push them to both Amsterdam and Barcelona. So this is a chance for you to review and visually just make sure that this is exactly what you want to do. And then if you're ready, you go ahead and click deploy, and that's that. So MSO will now make a connection to each of the Epgs that are running my 2 sites and ask them, can you please deploy these objects in your particular fabric? Okay, that's our first template, our stretch template example done. Now I need to go and create a few more templates to complete the picture for our Greenfield tenant. So I can add a new template up at the top here by clicking on the little plus button next to templates, and you'll see that it adds a new template for me. So let's actually create 2 templates. The first one I'll call AMS only. We can see that there. And then the second template, call it Barcelona or BCN only. Okay, so I'm going to work with Amsterdam first. So clicking on that particular template, again, just like before, we need to select which tenant we want to work with here. So clicking on the select tenant gives us the pull down menu. There's my tenant green, and off I go. So in Amsterdam, what I need to do is I need to create a single bridge domain, and I'm going to create 2 EPGs that I'm going to map to that bridge domain. So the first thing I'd like to do, scroll down and click on the area for bridge domain and click on plus, and that gives me my configuration options on the right. So I'm going to call this BD-AMS. We need to make a few choices about how this bridge domain will behave, but first important thing is we need to map it to a VRF. And if you remember in the common items stretch template, I created a VRF called V1, and that shows up in the list here. So I'll go ahead and create it. The next set of selections at a bridge domain level have to do with, is this bridge domain stretched? Is it working at pure layer 2? Is it working at layer 3? Do we want bum traffic, etc.? So in this particular example, I want this to be a purely routed layer 3 bridge domain. And in order to make that a reality, I need to untick some of these boxes here. So I'll go ahead and untick that, and we get a little warning, and it's useful to read. But that basically makes this bridge domain a layer 3 routed bridge domain living in site number 1 only. The next thing we need to do is create an application profile so we can actually create EPGs inside of that. So the first thing here is I'm going to click on application profile, and it will ask me to give it a name. So I'll just call this AMS, just to say that this application profile lives in Amsterdam only. Inside that application profile, I'm going to create 2 EPGs. So I can go ahead and click on add an EPG. I'm going to give this a name, AMS clients, and then I need to associate this to a bridge domain. So down here, we see there's the bridge domain AMS that we just created a few seconds ago. We'll go ahead and select that. In this particular simple example, I don't need to set any other more advanced options like microseg. So we've got AMS clients. Let's say I want to have a contract here. Let's say I want AMS clients to be a consumer of my contract that I created. So here at this level, I can click on the contract. I can actually create a new contract here if I want, specific to Amsterdam, but I have a contract that lives across both sites. And if you remember, I called that C1, and I can select it from the list. And then, of course, like with any contract, you have to set if it's consumer or provider. In this case, I'm going to set this guy to be a consumer and say save. I'll quickly create a second EPG, and I'll call this AMS servers. Same kind of thing. I'm going to map it to the bridge domain, and I need to apply the contract as well. In this case, I'll take the very same contract, C1, and I'll make this guy a provider, right? Because he's a server, and I'll go ahead and click save. Now, I've created a bridge domain and I've created some EPGs, but if you think about the bridge domain is my sort of gateway function where I put my subnets. But if I click on the bridge domain, where do you see that field to create subnets? Well, it doesn't actually live at this level when you have an item living specifically and only in one site, like BD AMS is in my example. So where would I go to actually configure or add that subnet to my bridge domain? Well, the first thing that I need to do is I need to take this template AMS only, and I need to add it to a site. So clicking on add sites, I only want this template to configure and exist in site number 1 Amsterdam. So I'm only going to click that box. So again, once I make that site level association, down here in the middle part of the window, you'll see my template AMS-only has shown up. It is not yet deployed. Now, in order to complete the configuration, we have to do what is called site-specific configuration. In this case, our bridge domain, which only lives in site AMS. So I'm going to click on that particular level, and you'll see I've got my EPGs and I've got my bridge domain. So I'm going to click on my bridge domain. And when you click on the bridge domain specific to the site that it lives in, you'll see down here in the right part of the configuration pane an area where I can put my subnets. So I'm going to go ahead and add my subnets here. I can add a description. I can make some choices about how I want this bridge domain, if it's advertised or not, etc. If I want to make those choices, I'll do that and go ahead and click save. Now, you can also add secondary subnets as well, and I'll do that just to show you that it is in fact easy and possible, and save that as well. So you can see I've got my 2 networks. The 2 dot network will be listed as a secondary network, just like it would in NXOS. Okay, so I've configured all of the site-specific stuff for my Amsterdam, my bridge domain, my subnet, etc. At this point, I'm actually ready to push it to the sites. So we can see here, under my site view, I've still got the yellow triangle here. So I need to actually deploy this configuration to site Amsterdam. So how would I do that? Well, if I go back and if I click on the template here, you can see I've got the button here that says deploy to sites. I'll go ahead and deploy that. Again, I get the little matrix of the objects, what's happening. In this case, things are being created and which sites are affected. In this case, only Amsterdam. So I'll go ahead and click deploy, and in just a second I should get the green window. There it is, and off we go. Let's jump really quickly to the APIC that's managing site number 1 Amsterdam. And if we take a look at a list view of all the tenants, we can see there's our tenant green. And in fact, it stands out because it has an extra little tag that was automatically put there that says, hey, this object or this tenant was created by MSO. If I actually click on the tenant, and at the top level, you can see I'm on tenant green. At the top, there's also this message, and please be aware of this, is that it says this has been created by multi-site, and it's basically warning you from this point forward, any changes or configuration that you want to do to tenant green, you should not do them in APIC, but that you should do them through MSO from this point forward. So any little object that's being managed or created by MSO will have an extra little icon, and you can see just at the corner here of green, the little building, there's a little gray sort of cloud-like icon, and that's another visual indicator that this particular object is owned and managed by MSO. Okay, back in MSO, now the next step is to create the Barcelona site-specific objects as well. Now, for the sake of time, because it's almost identical to what we did for Amsterdam, I've gone ahead and created those objects. But let me just kind of quickly walk you through the minor differences here. So I'm in the template called BCN only, and I've created a bridge domain called BD-BCN, and I've created an application profile called BCN, and I've got my BCN clients and my BCN servers, and I'm using the same contract C1 that, remember, exists equally in both sites. So that's not too different. The other thing here is under the association, which I've already done. I've already added the site here for Barcelona, and you see it show up down here. I've gone in, and in the BD-BCN, I've added the different subnet, this subnet of 192.168.3.1/24 lives only in Barcelona. Remember, we're only doing routing between sites in this particular example. And then I've got my Epgs, BCN clients and BCN servers there. Now, again, I haven't deployed it yet, but I just kind of wanted to show you that the Barcelona specific objects are there. They've got their unique values that are specific to Barcelona, and now I just need to deploy it to the sites, and that will complete the example of the Greenfield tenant. So I'll go ahead and click deploy, again, making sure that I'm creating these objects only in Barcelona, and I'll deploy. I got a green checkbox, that's what I want to see, and that's good. So as I said, that completes the sort of first schema example of what to do with a Greenfield tenant. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on and create a different schema, and we're going to actually do the importing and then import from one site and then move the specific information that we want to live in both sites. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, back into the APIC that's managing Site 1 Amsterdam. I just want to show you that under the Tenants tab, I have an existing tenant called Brown. This tenant existed in the ACI world long before MSO came along, right? So it's only existed in Amsterdam up until this point. And you can see that tenant Brown has a VRF, has bridge domains, it has some EPGs, it's got a contract there and some filters. Notice there are no indications, visual or text-based, that say this has anything to do with multi-site orchestrator, because at this point in time it does not. But we're going to change that. We're actually going to go back to MSO, and we're going to import this configuration into MSO so that we can put it into schema and templates, make some changes, and then decide to push this tenant across multiple sites. So here we are back in MSO. I need to tell MSO to import this tenant. I need to go under the site level view here, so under infrastructure and sites, and you can see here under Amsterdam, if I click on the three little dots to the far right, one of the options there is import tenants, and this is where I would go to do exactly that. So when I bring up the import tenants box, it's going to query the APIC in Amsterdam and say, hey, show me the tenants that you have available that I might want to import. And there's my tenant Brown. You can see I put a description there that says this is the existing tenant before MSO. So I'll go ahead and click OK. So once we do that, if we go have a look at the tenants view, we can see now MSO is aware that tenant Brown actually exists, and we can start doing some work with it. So at this point, let's create a new schema here, right? So we'll keep things nice and organized. So we'll call this Schema Brownfield, and we have a template here. Let's go ahead and, again, we're going to create a number of templates, things that are common across both sites, things that are specific to Site 1, things that are specific to Site 2. So again, I'll create a template here called Common Items. You can name it whatever you want. Let's go ahead and select our tenant. Again, here's the list. We don't want green, we want brown. There he is in the list with the description, so we're absolutely sure we're picking the right one. So now we're working with tenant brown. Rather than build all of this stuff manually like I just showed you before, there's a little button up here at the top called import that's going to allow me to import existing objects into the MSO world. And from that point on, MSO will manage and control those objects. Okay, let's click on import, and we can see that it will give us a list of sites that we can import information from. Now, it's only showing us one site, Amsterdam. Well, why is that? Well, MSO is smart enough to know that the only place that currently tenant brown lives is in Amsterdam, so that's the only place we could get information from. Now, that's also a reminder that we need to tell MSO that this tenant brown will ultimately also want to live in Barcelona, and I'll show you where we correct that. But for now, let's just do the importing into MSO from Amsterdam. Okay, here we see the window, and this is basically a list of all of the objects that we might be interested to import into MSO. And you can see here from the point of view of the site in Amsterdam, I've got a couple application profiles, I've got some EPGs, I've got contracts and filters and VRFs, BDs, etc. We need to carefully choose the objects that we want to import, and in this case, we only care about the objects that live equally across both sites. So in this particular case, I'm going to want the tenant, the VRF, filters, and the contracts. Now, we've already taken care of the tenant, but let's just bring in the contracts and filters. So if I click on the contract here, and I click on C2, notice over here on the right, we've got a column that says include relations. What this is saying is MSO is aware that there is at least one filter, in this case allow ICMP, that is already related to or connected to this contract object. And it's saying, hey, if you have that enabled, we want to bring the filter in with. If we don't want that, we would then disable this button and either select manually the filter or not import it at all. So we can see here, the filter is automatically selected by selecting the contract and including those related objects. We also want to include the VRF as well. And in that particular case, that's really all we want to start with as far as importing common items that live across both sites. So I'll go ahead and click import, and it will bring these objects into MSO. Okay, we can see here that we have successfully imported our short list of objects that commonly live across both sites. Now the next step would be to create additional templates that are site specific. So I'll go up here and I will create a template, and I'm going to call this template AMS because it will only live in Amsterdam. And just like before, we need to make sure that we're working with the proper tenant. In this case, we've got brown. Now, remember, brown already exists in Amsterdam. There are already bridge domains, EPGs, and all of that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and import a couple of things here. So we'll, just like before, we'll select AMS. Now, here we've got, again, the list of objects that we might be interested to import into MSO. So in this particular case, I actually want to grab a lot more things than last time. In this case, I want both of my application profiles. Down here, automatically, I'm going to bring in all of the EPGs because I'm including the related objects as well. Now notice it's an ANP, a VRF, a bridge domain. I'll get back to that. Down here, contract, no, we already imported the contract and filter in the step just before. Down here, notice that VRF is selected. Now we need to be careful here because we already imported VRF v2 in the common items step just before. If we were to try to import it again, we would get an error. So we need to make sure that we uncheck the box for v2. And then for bridge domain as well, we've got AMS and stretch, and we've got all of those relations as well. So now we're actually ready to import all of the things that at this point in time live uniquely in site number 1, Amsterdam. So here are all the objects that we just imported unique to Amsterdam. But if you scroll down, you'll notice a couple of things. We've got our 2 bridge domains that have an outline of red around them. That means there's a problem. We need to correct it. So if we hover over it, we can see a message that says, hey, some fields are missing. So if we go ahead and click on BD AMS, we can see that we're missing the association to the VRF. Now remember, we imported the VRF across common items. So all we have to do here is, from the pull-down list, select the proper VRF. We need to do the same thing for BD stretch as well. At this particular point, I could decide to deploy to sites here, but it reminds me that when I was working with the common items template, that I hadn't yet associated it to all of the sites. And in fact, if I click on add sites, you can see that Well, only Amsterdam is in the list. Well, why is that? Well, you remember I mentioned earlier that we needed to instruct MSO that this particular tenant Brown needs to live across both sites. So let's go ahead and fix that part first. So back here in the MSO main window under Application Management, we're gonna click into Tenants, and there's our tenant Brown. If you go to the far right, we've got the three dots. We're gonna click Edit, and we can see here that we forgot to associate this particular tenant to both of our sites. Now, I did that on purpose because I think that might be a common error that people might forget early on when they're beginning to work with templates and schemas. And so here we can fix it by simply ticking the box and saying Save. Okay, and coming back into my schema Brownfield, if we click on common items and we decide to add sites, we can see now that Barcelona shows up in the list, and we can select it and say save. So now we've got common items ready to go, ready to deploy across both sites. Now, what I need to do next is build a unique template that is specific for the objects that will live in Barcelona. So I'm going to go ahead and click on a new template here, give it a name, BCN. Now, for the sake of time in this video, I'm going to go ahead and pre-create all of the objects, but don't worry, I'm going to go and walk you through all of the things that I created to make sure that we're on the same page. Okay, so after a few seconds, here we go. I've got my site-specific template for Barcelona called BCN. Let's really just quickly walk through the things I created. First thing I did was, like I always do, is I start by selecting my tenant Brown. That's good. I've got my two EPGs that I've created. I've got BCN clients and BCN servers. If we take a look at clients, we can see I've already made the association to a bridge domain that I've created called BD-BCN, which we can see that is actually down here. I've created this object and I've associated it right to the VRF called V2. Now, in this particular case, this bridge domain, I want to be an isolated network that lives only in Barcelona. I don't want this one stretch, so I unticked the stretch box. Now, if I were to tick the stretch box, right, just for sake of showing you, is down here we've got the area where we can actually add the bridge domain subnet, right? Because if this was a stretch subnet, it would live equally in both, but that is not what I want. So by unticking the box, it gives you a nice little warning, but what's actually happening is the subnet configuration window disappears. Well, where does it go? Well, I'm going to show you in a minute, because if this network only lives in Barcelona, it is site specific to Barcelona, so we're going to have to configure it under the association of the site to Barcelona. I will show you that in just a minute. So we've got all of our objects. What we need to do here is we need to associate our site. This one only lives in Barcelona. That's good. We can see it show up in the list down here. Now remember where I talked about the bridge domain. So clicking under the site-specific association, right? If I click on bridge domain, we can see here on the right, this is where we would add the gateway subnet for this particular network. And if you remember, this network lives only in Barcelona, so site specific. I can make some choices about that subnet and click save, and there we go. Okay, well, at this point, I've got all of my configuration either imported or built. I've associated them to my sites, both common items across both and site specific to a given site. Let's deploy. So you can see here, I've got my yellow triangles across this, which basically means, hey, you've made configuration, but you haven't yet deployed it or pushed it to the site. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, when we deploy this configuration to the sites, you do this at the template level. So if I click on common items, clicking on deploy to sites, this is going to show me a nice little matrix of all of the things that will be deployed under this template and to which site. So we can see here, we've got our VRF, our contract, our filter. We can see that it's going to be created or deployed to Amsterdam and to Barcelona. That's exactly what we want. And we can click deploy. And we can see here that it has been successfully deployed. Now we're going to have to do the same thing for the site-specific templates of AMS and BCN. So clicking on AMS, again, we can say deploy to sites. Now notice this one is saying, I'm going to create some EPGs, some bridge domains, but only in the site AMS. And that's exactly what we want. Okay, so that's Amsterdam successfully deployed, and we'll just finish it off by doing the same thing for Barcelona. And again, we see here EPGs, bridge domains, and site-specific to Barcelona. Clicking deploy, and again, successfully deployed. If we look on the left, all of our little areas are now green, and that is exactly what we want to see. Okay, there's one more thing I want to do to complete this video. If you remember earlier on, I had a second application profile and a second bridge domain and EPG called stretch. And this particular use case I want to show you is those things currently live in Amsterdam only. In fact, we can see them here in the list. There's BD stretch, there's the AP called stretch, and of course the EPG. These only live in Amsterdam, site specific. We can verify that here. Now I want to take that bridge domain, that EPG, and that application profile, and I want them now to live equally in both sites, but I want it to be stretched, i.e. I want that bridge domain, that subnet, to live equally across both sites. I want that EPG to live equally across both sites. So how would I go about doing that? So in the area of Amsterdam where they currently live, there's another option up here at the top next to import, and it's called select. This will allow us to select certain objects and move them across different templates. I mean, how nice is that? So we will click on select and we can see here we've got some little boxes that appear. So we need to carefully select the things that we want to move. So I want the application profile, which automatically then pulls in the EPG stretch as well. And then if I go down here, I want to also bring over BD stretch. And it's really that simple. And then when I've selected all of my objects, the next step that I need to do is way up here in the right, there's the three little dots. If you click on those three little dots, you'll see we get some menu choices. And one of the choices is exactly what we want, is we want to migrate those objects. So we're going to go ahead and select that button. Here we can see a new window called Migrate Objects. We need to select our schema and our template. So here we can select our schema Brownfield and our template. We want to move this to common items because remember, this is now going to live equally across both sites. So we'll go ahead and select common items, and then we are ready to proceed. We'll click OK. You can see here again a nice summary window shows up of the exact objects that we're going to migrate. We can see the three objects that we selected coming from source template Amsterdam and going towards the target called common items, and it will be stretched from Amsterdam to Amsterdam and Barcelona, and that's exactly what we want. And again, we'll go ahead and proceed by clicking yes. And here we can see up at the top that we were successful in migrating our objects over to the template called common items. We can see down here that we have a yellow triangle, which means we haven't yet deployed this to Barcelona. So now we need to go ahead and do that. So if we click on common items, there's our AP EPG stretch. There's our bridge domain stretch. Now let's go ahead and click on bridge domain stretch. Remember, we want this bridge domain to be stretched at layer 2 across both sites. But if we look at the options here, we can see that L2 stretch is not selected. So I'm going to go ahead and select that box right there. And it says existing site local BD subnets will be removed, right? So we'll go ahead and click yes. That is perfectly fine. We have some other choices, like do we want to allow bum traffic or not? I want layer 2 stretch of the subnet, but I don't want the flooding of broadcast, unknown, unicast, and multicast traffic. We can still do things like vMotion, and that's the power of MSO and ACI. But there's one more thing we need to do. We need to go ahead and put the proper subnet here under the object that lives across both sites. So we'll go ahead and type that one in, just replacing the subnet, making some choices about that subnet's behavior, and clicking save. Now at this particular site, we're actually ready to go. We can see over here, again, our yellow triangle, which means not deployed to Barcelona yet, but that's okay. When we click deploy to sites, we can see here that we've already got it existing in Amsterdam because that's where it was before, but we need to go ahead and add it and stretch it to Barcelona. And so when we're ready, we'll go ahead and click deploy. And that's it. There we go. We've successfully imported something from one site, changed its configuration to be stretched, and deployed it across both sites. And let's quickly check back in with the Epgs managing each of our sites. So here in Amsterdam, we can see we've got the bridge domain, we've got BD stretch, there's the subnet 4.1. And if we take a look at the Epgs managing BCN, again, there's our BD stretch with the same information, same subnet, and off we go. So that concludes this particular demo section. On to the next lecture section with Max. Thank you very much.